There we go. And lovely to see everybody. So as Deborah says, welcome to Christmas, or at least the very start of it. And also to this Experts at Work session on creating complete leadership from incomplete leaders, which is a great title, I think. So Ben Vernazza, Ben is principal consultant for Edgecumbe Consulting, having previously worked with Saville Consulting and OPP Briggs Company, amongst others. His principal experience includes the design and delivery of assessment and development processes and the application of psychometrics, and he's an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. So Ben, I'm really grateful to you for doing this. Really interesting subject, and your background obviously incredibly relevant. Afterwards we'll send around Ben's slides and his contacts so you can get in touch if you'd like to know more. And Ben, thanks too. I think you were offering to send around a white paper that was pertinent to the subject, so that's great. Well, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you ever so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for your introduction, Richard, and also for inviting me to come and speak with you today. And a very warm welcome to this session, Creating Complete Leadership from Incomplete Leaders. And what I'm hoping to do today is to share some insights based upon how we find it useful to work with leaders ourselves. So sharing some of the research and the methodology that we use when we're teaching at business schools. And very often we're working with leaders who are transitioning between different roles or facing new challenges. And often we're trying to equip them with the insights that help them to move ahead on the next chapter of their leadership journey. So in terms of what we were looking to do today, so we have a 45-minute session. And the first point will be to start by looking at the state of play regarding leadership. And what I'll be doing is asking you to respond to a question. So we have a poll question, and you'll need your phones in order to access that. And I'll also offer some additional insights based upon some global research. We will then start to look at what do leaders need to do to create the conditions for success. So there are different elements that are important for them to focus on, and we'll concentrate on what those are. And we will then look at what holds leaders back from being truly complete. We'll then start to look at some different implications for how we can develop leaders. And I'll try and bring that to life by sharing a client case study as well. And then we'll have some time for some questions as well. So that's what we've got in store for today's session. And so we'll start by looking at the state of play around leadership. And some might say that what right now is a particularly tough time to be a leader. We've had once in a generation challenges like the pandemic, once in a career like Brexit, and we're having to grapple with new and emerging demands such as dealing with hybrid working, digitalization and AI. And all of this is placing great demands upon our leaders. So the first question that I'll be posing to you is, what is the biggest leadership challenge facing your organization right now? So at the bottom, you'll see that there's a code to access a Menti poll, which you can find at menti.com 3574 5901. And so what are the main challenges? Would it be leaders not knowing where to focus efforts, a lack of current leadership capability to meet short-term business goals, a lack of future leadership capability or pipeline to meet long-term business goals, leadership development not giving you the results you need, placing the right people into leadership positions, or leaders struggling to engage their people? Sure that some of you might want to put more than one as a challenge, but if you could put the most influential or the one that's having the greatest impact.
I like the focus of making us choose one there, Ben, because it's
I know it's
nice big questions.
Yeah. So I'll just give you another 10 seconds. Okay. Okay, well, let's start to see what was the most impactful area. Actually, it's starting to equal out a little bit right now. So we have even tied the first three. So leaders not knowing where to focus efforts, so perhaps being pulled in different directions. We see that there are some concerns about the leaders' capability to meet their short-term goals, as well as also leaders being able to meet long-term goals. So we're seeing both challenges from a short-term versus a long-term perspective, but also leaders struggling to engage their people as being the next highest scoring area. So it seems like across a range of different organizations, the challenges are presenting themselves in different areas. Now, let's start to connect that with what's happening across the globe as well. And what I'd like to then share with you is some research from the DDI Global Leadership Forecast. Now, this is a poll which goes out to over 13,000 leaders. It's based on 1,500 companies across the globe. And this gives us a really good barometer to see what is relevant within the leadership landscape. Now, interestingly, only 40% of leaders who were surveyed report that their company has high quality leaders. And this has seen a sharp decline from 2020 when the world was grappling with the pandemic. And there we really look towards our leaders to help us solve that crisis. And we really turn to their leadership in that moment. But since then, we've seen a steady decline in confidence in our leadership. We also see that only 12% of companies report that they have confidence in their bench strength. So who do we have waiting in the wings? And we've had challenges like the Great Resignation, which has really decimated our talent pools. And since then, companies have struggled to rebuild those. Now, the next finding is very concerning. So 72% of leaders are showing signs of burnout. So they're feeling spent by the end of the day. And also, moreover, many leaders are saying that they are struggling to help their teams deal with burnout as well. And if we look at trust, well, trust is vital to the success of any strategy. And only 46% of people say that they trust their manager. So does their manager do what they say they're going to do? And when we look at even more senior levels of leadership, that drops down to 32%. So there is a crisis of confidence or trust in our leadership. And if we look at what is really keeping leaders awake and up at night, then we see that they are concerned most primarily around attracting and retaining top talent, developing the next generation of leaders, and maintaining an engaged workforce. So what we're seeing here is that the war for talent is very much alive, and companies and, well, particularly CEOs are very concerned about retaining their key people, losing them to their competitors, but also how they can ensure that they're engaging and bringing out the best in their people. And we'll see the vital role that leaders play in that last part as well in just a few moments. Now, I think it'll be useful just to bring in a definition of leadership. There are so many definitions out there, and philosophers and researchers have been debating this for millennia. So the definition that we are using here comes from the book Leadership, No More Heroes, from our founder, David Pendleton. We have Adrian Furnham and John Cowell also contributing that book, and many of the insights we have are drawn from that book today. Now, the definition is that leadership is about creating the conditions for individuals, teams, and organizations to succeed. So we're seeing that leaders are not directly contributing to results, but they have a major influence on the people that do. And so the analogy that we draw here is that leadership is like gardening. So a gardener by himself or herself cannot grow tomatoes. They need a tomato plant to do that. But what they can do is work with the conditions to influence the yield of crops. So they need to make sure they plant the seeds at the right time of the year. The soil is well drained, fertilized. They need to adapt and take care of what's happening based upon how dry it is, how wet it is, and so on. And if they take care of these conditions, that should help them to have a bumpy yield of tomatoes at the end. Now, sounds good in theory. Didn't help with my own tomatoes this year, but hopefully you get the power of this analogy. And if we look at the impact that leadership has on organizations, then this has been something that has been debated as well. It's a bit controversial. Some people say it has no impact. But if you look at some of the research, then it accounts for between 13 to 15% of the variance in performance in organizations. Now, that might sound quite modest, but if you compare that to the world's leading painkiller, ibuprofen, that only accounts for 2% of the variance in pain relief symptoms. So leadership has a much greater impact upon elevating performance than ibuprofen does for curing pain. And there we were thinking that the leaders were causing us the headaches. Now, if we also then look at other research, then Forbes looked at it was a survey of 360 data looking at over 50,000 leaders. And what they found was when they carved up that group into different bandings, so they looked at the bottom 10% who were seen as the less effective leaders, the middle 80 were seen as the average leaders, and then the top 10%, the great leaders. Then it was the bottom 10% that actually lost the company money. The middle 80 made the company a profit, and the top 10% doubled the profits of the company. And if we also then look at how leadership works in organization, it is a team game. So when leaders are working towards a common vision, then they're twice as likely to have above median financial performance compared to other companies. And this is why when private equity firms are taking over an organization or seeking to make an acquisition, then they pay so much attention to the quality of the interactions at the top table. Now, if we look at then how does leadership create that impact, then we have to bring in this notion of employee engagement. And a lot of research has focused upon understanding how does leadership drive greater and great engagement. So when people feel engaged, they feel more bought into where the direction of the company is heading to. They feel more invested in where the company or what the company stands for. And they feel that they are involved and they can participate in shaping their own efforts. Now, a lot of the research hones in on a government task force called Engage for Success, which came around 2008, 2009. And they really wanted to look at the impact that engagement has on performance from a range of different companies. So they looked at a cross-section involving companies like Tesco's, BAE Systems, Google, John Lewis. And they were looking at different performance metrics and then seeing how engaged people were using survey data. And one of the research studies came from Kula and colleagues, and they found that when they compared the top quartile of companies that had higher engagement compared to the bottom quartile, those companies had 12% higher customer advocacy. So when people felt engaged, they did a better job of engaging their customers, and then their customers then felt more loyal, and they were stronger advocates for that company's brand. They also had 18% higher productivity, and that was just a range. Or that's the median within a range. So some companies reported as high as 40% higher productivity, and they had 12% higher revenues. But also they managed to reduce employee turnover by 30% and reduce workplace accidents. So investing in driving up employee engagement not only was a source of competitive advantage, but also failing to do so was a key risk for organizations. And if we start to try and unravel that relationship, how do we get from leadership to performance? There is not a direct relationship between leadership and performance. We have to go through a sequence of steps to get there. And leadership doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's very much influenced by context, and leaders play a pivotal role in terms of creating that context. And the ways they do that are by shaping culture. So culture is defined as the way we do things around here. It's the organizational DNA. So this is about setting norms. It's about the unwritten assumptions that guide how people should behave. And the other element is then climate. So this is more about capturing the mood or the feeling in an organization. So how does it feel to work here? And this is subjectively experienced. And the ways that leaders may shape these, it's about establishing those norms, behavioral expectations for culture. For looking at climate, the two ways they do that are by setting the tone in terms of establishing psychological safety. So a lot has been written about this in recent years, but the more that leaders make themselves vulnerable to talk openly about their thoughts and feelings, the more that encourages their team to feel able to do the same, and also that people feel that their manager has their back. And in terms of meaningfulness, this is all about really ensuring that people feel stretched and recognized for their performance, but also that what they are doing has some impact. So it links to a grander purpose. And when leaders are taking care of those conditions, this is what encourages people to release their discretionary efforts so they work harder for longer. And if you have a critical mass of people that all feel the same way, this is what links to that uplift in performance that we saw on the slide before. So what do leaders do in that first circle there? Well, here we can turn to some research from Kaiser and Hogan. And what they said was that at any one time, leaders have to move between two different types of focus and two different styles of leadership. So leaders need to demonstrate strategic leadership. So they need to look to the future, they need to set direction, and they need to be more open to new ways of working and be more inventive. Whereas operational leadership concerns the here and now. So how do we focus our efforts on what needs to happen and get things done? And in terms of style, we have more forceful leadership, which is more directive. It's about asserting yourself, calling the shots, so to speak. Whereas enabling leadership is more nurturing, empowering, and about really involving people in shaping the way forward. And it's the responsibility of leaders to manage those competing tensions, to avoid the risks of underplaying, overplaying any of those different styles or focuses at the wrong time. So we can layer that into our picture of leadership as well. Now, what else do leaders need to do? Well, here we can turn our attention to looking at the tasks that leaders need to perform. And here we have the framework, the primary colours, which was devised by our founder, David Pendleton. And what he noticed was when he spoke to leaders, they often struggled to talk about leadership. They needed to go off into their cupboard, dust off a pamphlet that the company produced many years ago, and it was only then that they could start to talk about leadership. So whatever it represented to them, it wasn't something that was accessible and memorable. So he set off to look at the leadership literature and looked at different meta-analyses. And what emerged was that there were 3 core domains of leadership, which is consistent with the work of people like Gary Uckel. So we have a part which is using our head, which is the strategic domain that concerns how do we make sense of our environment, how do we look ahead, and how do we chart where people need to go. We have the hands within our model, which would relate to the operational domain. So how do we focus upon getting things done? How do we mobilize resources and make sure that we deliver? And then we have the heart, which relates to how do we connect to people? So this is the interpersonal domain. How do we bring people with us along on that journey? And within each of those domains, we then see different leadership tasks, which describe what leaders need to do rather than how they need to do it. And so if we look at those tasks, some will feed into the domains in a pure way, and some will overlap between more than one domain. So setting strategic direction concerns really analysing our options, being able to look across the organisation, look outside of it, but it's very much future focused, so looking ahead and where we need to go. Planning and organising is then the bridge between strategic and operational domains. So this concerns how do we initiate structure, how do we organise our efforts, how do we plan ahead, but also the more that the goals sit in the future, the more that's in the strategic domain, the more we're looking at prioritising what needs to happen, the more that is in the operational. Delivering results is then the harder edge of leadership. So how do we show tenacity, determination, and push things through? Teamworking is then the bridge between the interpersonal and the operational. And this concerns effectively how do we work in a collegiate way with people, but also how do we make sure that the team's efforts are productive. Building and sustaining relationships is then the central task of the interpersonal domain. So how do we forge new alliances? How do we sustain relationships? And how do we also work through difficult situations and manage conflict? Creating alignment is then the bridge between the strategic and the interpersonal domain. So how do we align people to a vision of the future? And how do we bring people with us in terms of influencing them, involving them in shaping the way forward, and building coalitions of the willing. And then we see that sweet spot in the middle where we focus these three pure colors of light. We get white light in the middle. That's what we call leading. And leading here is about being able to act as a conductor within the orchestra and knowing when to lean into the different domains or the tasks at the right time. So an analogy that we might draw here is to, well, based upon the work of Ronald Heifetz. He once said that leaders are sometimes caught up on the dance floor with a nice shiny disco ball in the center. And there they are having a good boogie with their colleagues, their team workers. And sometimes, as hard as it may seem, the leader needs to recognize when to step off the dance floor, walk upstairs, go onto the balcony, and really look at the whole dance floor and ask questions such as what is really going on here, and therefore what needs to happen now. And leaders don't do enough of that. So we have these different elements of leadership, and the last one that was then made explicit was this notion of coping with pressure. So how do we stay fit to lead? And here we're interested in whether leaders demonstrate resilience. And this is something which is seen as almost a bedrock upon which the rest of your leadership is constructed upon. So if it's on shaky ground, that has the power to really disrupt your leadership overall. And it could mean that you withdraw from other people. It could mean that you run off like a headless chicken and so on. It has the power to completely derail your leadership. So bringing that all back together and looking at how we can overlay a different lens on top of this, then going back to that definition between more strategic versus operational, and also overlaying the more forceful versus the more enabling leadership, we can see that this is placed in this alignment as we see here. And there may be a more comfortable place for you to be on this framework. There may be a particular part of this framework which feels just more natural, and that's because our personality will overlay upon our leadership. And interestingly, when we start to examine this and look at how we can predict based upon personality your ability to demonstrate these different types of focus or styles, then there is a particular formula that's used to predict strategic leadership. So those who are more idealistic and adaptive, or if we're using the Big Five terminology, people who are high on openness, low on conscientiousness, tend to be more aligned to that more future-focused leadership. Whereas operational is predicted by those who are more pragmatic and structured. So openness is lower, conscientiousness is higher. And if we look at your different styles, then forceful leadership is predicted by those who are more resilient, extroverted and competitive. So lower neuroticism, higher extroversion, higher agreeableness. And it's the reverse for enabling leadership. So those who are more sensitive, introverted and cooperative. So higher neuroticism, lower extroversion and higher agreeableness tend to fare better at enabling leadership. So our personality will influence the ease with which we can demonstrate these different styles and focuses. And this is a pivotal point. So leaders are inherently incomplete. So it's as if our personality is, is something which guides our behavior. It doesn't completely explain it, but it's as if we have a stake in the ground and we are tied to a bungee cord. And so we can operate in different ways, but normally we will be brought back to what feels more comfortable to us, particularly when we're feeling more pressured. And the analogy that we'll draw here is to that of the heptathletes. So here we have Jessica Ennis-Hill, who won gold in the 2012 Olympics. And in the heptathlon, there are 7 different events which overlap or are linked to 3 domains. So we have running events, jumping, and throwing events. Now, Jessica was a great and very fast runner. She was very capable at the jumping events, but she wasn't so great at the throwing events. And if she were to try to readdress that balance, then there would be different tensions or different trade-offs in terms of training and getting the balance right. So if she were to try and improve her throwing game, she would need to bulk up and build up her muscles, but that would then inhibit her flexibility and would likely slow her down. So with the heptathlete, they are seeking to become excellent at the better events whilst being good enough at their weaker events, rather than trying to become well-rounded. And this is the analogy that we use when working with leaders as well. We're not seeking to create well-rounded leaders, but to help them to understand where they play their best moments, but also how can they become good enough at the elements that they're weaker in. And so here we have this notion that leaders need to draw upon other people, perhaps to complement the areas that they're weaker in. And so Raff and Conchi are the proponents of strengths-based leadership. They carried out a 30-year-long study, looked at over 1.7 million people, and they found that whilst the best leaders are not well-rounded, the best teams are. Effective leaders surround themselves with the right people and build on each person's strengths. So I think that this is a very powerful notion to see how we can create complete leadership from really utilising other people. And so we very much see that leadership is a team game, and other supporting research shows that from Lanewand and colleagues, they looked at over 700 leaders and found that only 8% were rated as being both good at strategy and execution, which is similar to our operational domain. And also Kaiser and colleagues looked at those different styles and focuses and found that only 10% of managers and executives were rated as being truly good at all of those different elements. So leaders really, or well-rounded leaders really are in the minority. And we also find in our own work as well, so we've assessed now thousands of leaders against our own framework, and we've yet to find a truly complete leader who excels at all of the different tasks. Maybe you're out there in the audience, we just haven't come to you yet. But I think there is some encouragement in that fact as well. So rather than seeing that leaders are heroes that have to be good at everything, that it is quite natural, in fact, is what we expect to see, that leaders will have some areas that they're naturally more aligned to and other things which come more as a challenge for them. But where leaders are able to play to their strengths, then this carries great benefits. So in our own research, then leaders who play to their strengths are rated more highly overall. And some research from Seligman shows that when leaders are able to be able to play to their strengths, they feel a greater sense of authenticity, that they feel that they are able to search for opportunities to deploy their strengths, and there's some benefit from being able to experiment and learn how they can use that in different circumstances. But also, where they are able to do that, they're more likely to feel invigorated by the end of the day rather than feeling exhausted. And this could help to overcome some of the challenges with burnout that we saw earlier on. So one of the ways that we use these insights when working with leaders is to help them think about how personality interrelates with performance. And so what are the implications for how we can use different strengths and be aware of our limitations? So where we have a natural strength, this is where we're seen as being effective at a task. And this also is aligned with our personality traits. So this is something that comes quite naturally to us. And so it's as if we are rated maybe as being effective at planning and organizing, and we're also highly conscientious. A fragile strength is where we're seen as being effective at that task, but it's not aligned with our personality. Therefore, it probably comes at some cost to us. So we could be seen as being effective at planning and organizing, but actually we're not conscientious at all. So we probably learn some strategy, but if we don't keep exercising those muscles, we may find that our performance starts to slide over time. Potential strengths are where we're seen as being not effective at that task, and actually our personality is very aligned with that. So therefore, this could become a strength with some concerted effort. So it's almost as if we've been gifted a great hand at poker. We've just not really learned the rules of poker, so we don't know how to play the game. And the final category is what we call a resistant limitation, where we're seen as less effective at that task, and also our personality is not compatible. And therefore, to see that we can turn this to a strength overnight is less realistic. And it may be more likely that we can, that we can find ways to work around this. So, for example, we're not seen as being effective at planning and organizing, and we're not conscientious. Now, very often when we're working with leaders, we find that they have always been told to work on the resistant limitations. and they haven't found it successful. They're not very motivated by it, and they become a little bit jaded with that. So helping leaders to really understand, well, where can they spend their developmental resources to have the greatest impact, maybe a more beneficial use of their time. And it may be more useful for them to think of how they can cover their resistant limitations with the strengths of one of their colleagues and work around it. So here we have some questions that you can ask yourselves or the leaders that you work with. So you'll see those in the slides when I share them with you later on as well. So if I just round this up by then sharing a case study, so how we might bring this all together. And the example that we're using here is that of an IT delivery team set within a government organisation. And they were charged with leading on the digital transformation of the organisation. So they were moving from a world of systematic project management towards being more agile and to developing products. And this was seen as a business critical program of work, but something which they needed to achieve also in a short space of time. So they really needed to make sure that the team could be set up to be to hit the ground running and to accelerate the process towards becoming a high performing team. Now, all the leaders completed a 360 and a personality questionnaire, which was the NEO. And what we see to begin with is the overall scores looking at those leadership tasks. So this is based upon 360, so looking at their performance as a team. So where they had a clear strength was around building and sustaining relationships and team working. Where they had a gap in particular was planning and organizing and delivering results, so very much in that operational domain. And when we started to unpack that, so looking at this at a more granular level, so we're looking at particular items within the questionnaire that were the most, the highest rated, we can see that a lot of the strengths came from around how they were working with people, maintaining good relationships, but also the area that taps into strategy was also quite a people-oriented aspect, so acting as role models and demonstrating the values. Where they were faring less well, so we see here that it was around managing performance, dealing with underachievement, prioritizing, so very much in that operational domain, but also how they were reviewing and analyzing different strategic options and also being open towards different radical changes as well. And then if we look at how personality overlays into this picture, so here we're using domains and the overall proportion of the group that were either low, sitting in the middle, in the average, or high. And neuroticism is how we cope with pressure. We see that the majority of the leaders were feeling less well adjusted. So the pressures that they were facing were then having an impact upon them personally. If we look at extroversion, then they lent more towards introversion, and interestingly, they were scoring very high upon that interpersonal domain. So maybe their focus was more upon the quality of relationships rather than breadth and quantity. Looking at openness, which is around thinking style, most people sat within the middle, so as open towards new thinking and ideas as most. Agreeableness, which is looking at how accommodating people are, the strongest proportion were more adaptable. So they were people who tended to go along to try and collaborate, to make decisions consensually, but perhaps what was missing was that focus upon challenging groupthink and so on. And then finally, when looking at conscientiousness, we see that most people tended to be more flexible and perhaps disorganized, so comfortable with a certain amount of chaos, and perhaps this was then explaining some of the results around that operational domain, but also could also be impacting upon their levels of emotional stability. And then bringing that all together to then look at their strengths as a team. Here we see that there are the different participants in the columns, and where we have clear strength overall was in that interpersonal domain. So very much relating to people, team working, there were great strengths that they could harness as a team. Where they were faring less well, so planning and organizing, they have a couple of people who have this as a fragile strength, so they need to make sure that they maintain those. Some people that could develop this as a strength over time, but where there was a clear gap was delivering results. So no one who had this as a clear strength for them. Some people who could develop this into a strength over time, but many people who had this as a resistant limitation. So armed with this knowledge, they could then start to understand, well, what could they do as a team to bridge this gap? Now, sometimes a team may be able to bring in someone into the team that can plug some of those gaps, but more often than not, teams have to work with what they have and use the information to help understand, well, how can they make sure that they can harness the strengths, but also take care of any clear weaknesses. So then in terms of how they use the information, one of the things they needed to do was to develop greater complementarity within the team. So they did an exercise looking at bids and offers where they made a bid for support from their colleagues, but also offered their own support based upon their insight into their own strengths and weaknesses. And then collectively as a team, they realized the need to have a greater transparency to their ceiling of delivery. So being able to say no, and also be aware of what they were charged with. There was a tendency for them to respond to the person who was shouting the loudest. So they needed to make sure that they were linking things back to their strategic priorities, but also making sure that they were clear about what success looked like, so that they weren't then just letting things creep in terms of the scope, keep on raising and escalating, and to be more systematic about how they were planning and organizing their efforts. So hopefully that's just a useful way of seeing how we can use the insights to then create more complete leadership within the team as a whole. So I'll just leave you with some takeaways from today's session. So leadership's main impact comes from creating the conditions for success. So it's about shaping culture, establishing psychological safety and meaningfulness. And leaders are always having to manage these competing tensions around demonstrating more strategic versus operational leadership, being more empowering or enabling versus being more directive and forceful. And personality very much influences how easily we can take on these different styles and focuses. Therefore, leaders are inherently incomplete. And the way that we create complete leadership is by helping leaders know how to harness the strengths and the qualities of their colleagues, as well as their own, but also how they can develop greater complementarity across the team. And I'll just leave you with this final quote that comes from Ancona and colleagues, a great paper called In Praise of the Incomplete Leader. So it's time to celebrate the incomplete. That is the human leader.
Fantastic, Ben. I love the clarity you brought to that. Not to say the amount of research, that's the backbone of it too. Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Ben. Much appreciated.
It's my pleasure.
Time for one or two questions, perhaps. Just raise your hand or dip in. Love to hear from you. Annika, that was quick. Thanks for your quotes, Annika. Please do go to the chat, everyone, if you haven't seen 2 quotes from Annika already and a recommendation from Kirsia. Annika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Richard. Ben, absolutely love that. Thank you. A question I have is the 83% reactive. When we look at the distribution and not addressing underachievement, do you find, or is that too simplistic to say that there's a conflict avoidance because they're trying to mitigate the discomfort of being reactive?
I think that could be interesting to unpack and see what was leading to them being reactive, and so it was almost as if they were like a swan gliding gracefully across the lake whilst underneath they were furiously paddling, right. And it was taking a toll on them personally, but it wasn't then something that was being seen as for the team as a collective. And sometimes that's something which is quite interesting to unpack, that actually it's the team members themselves that may be struggling, but they don't know that their other colleagues are also struggling as well. And that's what we were seeing with that team. So it was taking a toll on them personally, but it wasn't something that was necessarily visible in terms of how they were operating, in terms of demonstrating their resilience as well.
Thank you. But
a great question,
Annika. Yeah, it was a great question. Thanks, Annika. Ali, hello.
Hello, that was excellent. Thank you. Really insightful. I think one of the things I was reflecting on is I think where we've spent, I guess, generations of leaders thinking they have to be more of a complete leader. What response have you had from leaders where there's an element of trust and vulnerability in this, isn't it, to be incomplete? And how have leaders responded to having to talk quite openly about where they aren't complete?
Yes, I think that's a great question, Ali. So I think that when we sometimes speak to the leaders individually, there is almost a great sense of relief to understand, actually, that's really reassuring. I've always felt that I've had to be good at all these things and I'm not. So that feels very liberating for them individually. But it also then comes back to this notion of psychological safety. So within the leadership team, and often where we deal with teams who've been working together for a very long time, it's surprising how there still may not be a sense of psychological safety in that team. And so it does require some courage for those leaders to be open and to really say, listen, I'm going to make myself vulnerable. I'm going to say it how it is, or really reveal something personal to me, which people may not know within that group. So it does take some work and some effort, but it's really building upon that notion of elevating psychological safety in order for people to feel comfortable to do that as well. And I think also maybe across the organization, then sometimes where people can start to be more open, that can start to encourage other people to feel that they can also be open about themselves as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Ben, thank you again. We're up to our time. Perfect timing, really, Ben. If anyone would like to stay on for 5 minutes with Ben, I'm assuming that's all right, Ben.
Of
please
course.
do. Thank you. And any feedback in the chat will be much appreciated, and we'll see you in the next one. Ben, thank you ever so much again. Nice to see you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.